Officer Riker's violent encounter with Marcus. Look at me when I'm talking to you, boy. Officer Dale Riker's voice sliced through the quiet diner like a hot knife through butter. The casual chatter among the after-school crowd was silenced in an instant. The weight of his words hit the room with a heaviness that no one could ignore. Marcus Holloway, sitting at the booth with his friends, froze. He could feel the heat rising from the officer's glare, but what came next took him completely off guard. Without warning, Riker's hand moved faster than Marcus could react. The back of his hand cracked across Marcus's cheek with such force that the sound echoed like a gunshot through the diner. The shock of the hit made Marcus's head snap sideways, his face slamming against the cold window, the impact sending a shiver through his body. The sting from the slap spread like fire, but the most disturbing thing wasn't the pain, it was the look on Riker's face. His anger, his arrogance, it was all too much. As Marcus struggled to regain his balance, he felt Riker's presence looming over him, the officer's breath heavy with fury. The gleam of his badge caught the light as he leaned in closer, tightening his grip on Marcus's collar. "Next time you laugh when I walk in, you'll remember who's in charge here," Riker hissed through clenched teeth, his words dripping with venom. Marcus stayed still. His cheek burned where Riker's hand had left its mark, but he didn't flinch. He refused to show weakness even though the pain was sharp. The slap had been unexpected, violent, and completely unprovoked, but Marcus wasn't about to give Riker the satisfaction of seeing him break. He knew the officer didn't realize who he had just struck, the one person in this town who had enough power to bring him down. Riker didn't know that Marcus's father, Isaiah Holloway, outranked every officer in the room. He didn't know that one act of brutality, especially in front of witnesses, would lead to a much bigger storm than he could handle. Marcus's mind raced as the adrenaline started to wear off. His heart hammered in his chest, but his body remained still. The air in the diner was thick with tension. All eyes were on them, but no one dared to speak. Riker's hand still gripped Marcus's collar, pulling him upright with every witness in the diner watching. It was as though the officer was daring anyone to challenge him. But no one moved. No one spoke. The fear in the room was palpable, and Riker reveled in it. Then, just as quickly as he'd arrived, Riker released Marcus, letting go of his collar like it was nothing more than an afterthought. He straightened his uniform and smirked at the young boy, taking his time as he prepared to leave. "Not so funny now, is it, boy?" Riker sneered as he turned on his heel and made his way to the door, leaving Marcus to stand there, his cheek burning, his heart racing. The bell above the door chimed as Riker left, and the diner's atmosphere was finally able to breathe again. The room was left in a heavy silence, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Marcus's friends, Jamal and Trevor, sat motionless, their faces pale with shock. The laughter that had filled the air just moments before seemed like a distant memory. The whole diner felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Riker was gone. For now. The diner scene and aftermath. The silence in the diner was thick, almost suffocating as the customers slowly began to breathe again. The bell above the door had barely stopped ringing when Jamal finally spoke up, his voice low and uncertain. "Man, that was messed up." He glanced around the room, clearly shaken by what had just unfolded. Trevor, still pale and visibly rattled, didn't say anything at first. His eyes were glued to Marcus, who was standing frozen by the window, trying to process what had just happened. The slap had come out of nowhere, and the force behind it had left them all in shock. Nora Jensen, the diner owner, stood behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped down the coffee station. She had seen Riker's type before, the kind of man who used his badge to bully people, to instill fear. But today she had seen something that made her question just how far this man was willing to go. She had watched it all unfold from behind the counter, her stomach churning with every moment. "Marcus," Nora called out softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. "Are you all right?" She couldn't just stand there. She had to ask, even if she knew that no one in the room was going to say anything. Not in front of a cop. Marcus didn't respond at first. He was too stunned, his hand still pressed against his burning cheek. His gaze was fixed on the table in front of him, the water from his glass now spreading across the checkered floor. It wasn't until Trevor moved to grab some napkins that Marcus finally spoke. "I'm fine," he muttered, his voice strained. But the way he said it didn't sound convincing. He wasn't fine. He couldn't be. What had just happened was no small thing, it was a violent assault and they all knew it. But no one else in the diner was brave enough to speak up. They all turned away, pretending like nothing had happened. People were used to staying quiet around cops like Riker. They had seen it all before, the bullying, the intimidation. It was just part of the culture in this town. Trevor sat down at the booth next to Marcus, his eyes wide with concern. "Man, you okay?" His voice was low, filled with both worry and anger. Marcus looked up, meeting his friend's eyes. He didn't say anything at first, but the way his jaw clenched, the way he refused to let anyone see how much the slap had hurt, spoke volumes. "I'll be all right," Marcus said again, though this time it was clear he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But even as he said the words, Marcus knew they weren't true. He could still feel the heat from Riker's slap. He could still hear the officer's voice, dripping with malice. He could still see the look of pure arrogance in Riker's eyes as he strutted out of the diner, leaving a wake of fear behind him. The door chimed again, and for a moment Marcus tensed. Was Riker coming back? But it wasn't him. Instead, it was Isaiah, Marcus's father, walking through the door with his usual calm, steady demeanor. But something in the way he looked around the room, something in his eyes, told Marcus that this wasn't going to end quietly. Isaiah's gaze locked onto his son, and he could see the mark on his face before he even reached the booth. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing at first. Instead, he moved to sit beside Marcus, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We'll take care of this," Isaiah said, his voice firm and unwavering. It was a promise. A promise that things weren't going to end here, that Riker's actions wouldn't go unnoticed. Isaiah's arrival and plans for justice. Isaiah Holloway sat down next to Marcus with a calmness that contrasted the storm building inside him. He could see the anger and confusion in his son's eyes, but he knew the boy needed reassurance, not panic. Marcus had been through a lot, but Isaiah wasn't going to let this moment define him. No, this was the beginning of something bigger. "Are you okay, son?" Isaiah asked, his voice low and controlled. His gaze flicked to the red handprint already starting to swell on Marcus's cheek. Marcus, who had been staring at the table, finally looked up at his father. His eyes held a mix of emotions, fear, frustration, and a small spark of defiance. "I'm fine, Dad," he replied, but his voice cracked just a bit. There was no hiding the hurt, not anymore. Isaiah gave him a small nod, his hand still on his son's shoulder. He wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but Isaiah knew better. Nothing was going to be okay until they made it right. Turning to Nora, who had been watching the exchange in silence, Isaiah spoke with quiet authority. "Thank you for calling me. We're going to make sure this gets handled." Nora nodded, her own eyes still wide with disbelief. She'd lived in this town long enough to know how things worked. Cops like Riker ran the show, and if you weren't careful they would crush you without a second thought. But today she saw something different in Isaiah. He wasn't backing down, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. "I have everything on video," Nora said, pointing to the small black security dome mounted on the corner of the wall. "The whole thing. The slap, the threats. Everything." Isaiah's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. "Good. I'll need that footage," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "We'll make sure it's safe." Marcus looked between his father and Nora, confusion written across his face. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and curiosity. Isaiah gave him a reassuring look. "We're going to do things by the book. I'm going to contact the right people. People who can make sure Riker answers for what he did. He won't get away with this." But even as he said the words, Isaiah knew it wasn't going to be that simple. He had spent years working in the FBI, dealing with corruption, civil rights violations, and abuse of power. He had seen how systems like the one Riker was part of operated. And this was no different. The whole town knew Riker's reputation, but no one had dared to do anything about it. Until now. "I'm going to need your help, Nora," Isaiah said, turning back to the diner owner. "If you're willing, I'll need you to send me the footage and any other information you've got. We're going to put this whole thing together." Nora hesitated for a moment, but she saw the determination in Isaiah's eyes. She nodded slowly. "You have my full support." Isaiah turned back to Marcus, giving his son's shoulder a squeeze. "This isn't over, son. Not by a long shot." Marcus met his father's gaze, and for the first time since Riker slapped him, he felt a sense of confidence. Whatever came next, he wasn't alone. The corruption uncovered. Isaiah sat in his home office late that night, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. The footage from Nora's diner security system was safely stored on his computer, but he knew it wasn't enough. What had happened to Marcus wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. The system Riker was a part of wasn't just about one officer abusing his power. It was about a network of corruption that had seeped into every corner of the local government, the police department and the town's power structures. Isaiah knew that in order to bring Riker and the others down, he needed more than just the footage. He needed a full investigation, one that would expose the system of intimidation and abuse that had been allowed to thrive for years. The more he dug, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran. He pulled up the records of previous complaints against Officer Riker, hoping to find a pattern. As he sifted through the documents, a disturbing picture began to form. There were dozens of complaints, many of them filed by people too afraid to come forward. Each time the case was dismissed, the evidence erased or simply ignored. And always the same name appeared: Judge Matthews. Isaiah's eyes narrowed as he scanned through the files. Judge Matthews had dismissed every complaint against Riker, every single one. His decisions were quick, final, and always in Riker's favor. It wasn't a coincidence. Isaiah had seen this kind of thing before. When corruption ran this deep, it wasn't just about one officer, it was about a whole system protecting its own. Isaiah knew that if he was going to expose this, he needed to connect the dots between Riker, Judge Matthews, and anyone else who was covering for them. The town was filled with people too scared to speak out, people whose lives were held hostage by fear. The corruption wasn't just in the police department, it was in the town hall, the courthouse, and the businesses that relied on the local government. They all turned a blind eye, hoping that if they stayed quiet, they would be left alone. But Isaiah wasn't going to stay quiet. He couldn't. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Catherine Martinez, DOJ, he said when the phone picked up. "I've got something big. I need your help." Catherine was a contact he had worked with before, someone who knew how to handle cases like this. She had the resources, the authority, and most importantly, the courage to stand up to the system. She listened carefully as Isaiah explained what he had uncovered. "This is bigger than I thought," she said after a long pause. "We'll start the review immediately. We'll need all the evidence you've gathered, witness statements, the financial records, everything. This is the kind of case we've been waiting for." Isaiah sat back in his chair, allowing himself a moment of relief. This was the breakthrough he needed. It wasn't just about one corrupt officer anymore, it was about taking down an entire system. And with Catherine's help, they were finally going to expose it for everyone to see. Witnesses speak out, but fear holds them back. Isaiah spent the following days gathering every scrap of evidence he could find. He was relentless, going through every file, every record, every witness statement he could get his hands on. Each document he uncovered painted a clearer picture of the corruption in the town, a web of deceit, cover-ups, and intimidation. But even with all this, there was one thing Isaiah knew he needed more than anything else: witnesses willing to step forward. But the witnesses were terrified. He had already spoken to a few people, and every one of them had expressed the same fear. They wanted to help, but they were too scared of the consequences. Some were afraid of losing their jobs, others feared retaliation from the police, and many simply didn't believe that anything would change. Isaiah couldn't blame them. In a town like this, where the police force seemed to run everything, speaking out against Riker or anyone in power was a dangerous gamble. But Isaiah was determined to prove that it didn't have to be this way. He needed to show the people of this town that the system could be broken, that fear didn't have to control them anymore. He continued to reach out to anyone he could think of who might have witnessed Riker's actions, hoping to find someone brave enough to come forward. One night, as he sat in his home office reviewing more records, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Nora Jensen. "They're here," it read, followed by a second message: "2 officers. Routine inspection. They're making threats about violations." Isaiah's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what this meant. The police were trying to intimidate Nora into staying silent. They had already tried to destroy the evidence once, and now they were coming for her. He quickly grabbed his coat and keys and headed out the door. If the officers were making threats, it was time to make sure they knew they couldn't just push people around anymore. When Isaiah arrived at the diner, he found Nora behind the counter, her face tense as she spoke with the 2 officers, Brady and Martinez. Both of them wore tight smiles, their postures stiff as they made small talk about the diner's security system. But it wasn't the technical check they were interested in. It was a threat disguised as an inspection. Isaiah walked in without hesitation, his presence filling the space. "I'm sorry, officers," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Is there a problem with the diner's security?" The officers turned to face him, their smiles faltering for just a moment. Brady, the taller of the 2, put on a forced grin. "No problem at all, Mr. Holloway. Just a routine check. Just making sure everything's in order." Isaiah didn't buy it. Routine check? I've never heard of this before. Why don't you go ahead and show me the paperwork for this inspection? Brady's smile vanished, and for a split second the mask slipped. He wasn't prepared for Isaiah's directness. Martinez, sensing the shift, stepped forward. "It's new department policy," she said, trying to sound casual. "Nothing to worry about." But Isaiah wasn't buying it. He knew this wasn't about routine, it was about sending a message. He glanced over at Nora, who was standing nearby, her eyes wide with fear but also with a spark of defiance. She was starting to realize that things were changing. Isaiah wasn't going to let them intimidate her, or anyone else, into silence. The growing threat. The tension in the diner was palpable as Isaiah stood his ground, eyes fixed on the two officers who were doing their best to look nonchalant. Brady and Martinez exchanged a quick glance, but neither of them dared to make a move. Isaiah's calm, measured presence was impossible to ignore. They were used to intimidating people, but they had clearly underestimated him. Isaiah took a step forward, his voice steady and controlled. "I know my rights, officers. You need a warrant to access my private security system. If you're here for a routine check, then show me the proper paperwork." Brady looked momentarily caught off guard. He stammered slightly, clearly uncomfortable under Isaiah's unflinching gaze. "We're just doing our job, Mr. Holloway. Making sure the system is up to code." "Up to code?" Isaiah echoed, raising an eyebrow. "I've never heard of this routine check. You're here to intimidate Nora, aren't you? Try to get her to keep quiet." The officer's expressions shifted, but they didn't back down. Martinez crossed her arms, her face hardening. "You're mistaken. We're just doing our job." Isaiah knew exactly what they were doing. They were trying to make Nora feel like she had no choice but to comply, to give in to their threats. But that wasn't going to happen, not on his watch. You can keep trying to make her feel small, but it won't work. Not anymore. The room was still, every person in the diner watching the standoff unfold. Nora, though still visibly nervous, straightened her back, her gaze meeting Isaiah's. He could see the shift in her demeanor, the quiet resolve taking root as she realized she didn't have to be afraid anymore. Isaiah was right. They weren't alone. Finally, Brady sighed, realizing that their intimidation tactics weren't working. He and Martinez exchanged another look, this one more resigned than the last. "We'll be back with the proper paperwork," Brady said, his voice tight with annoyance. "But you're right, Mr. Holloway. We don't want to cause any trouble." Isaiah nodded, his voice firm. "You can go now." The officers turned and walked out, the bell above the door chiming as they left. But the moment they were gone, Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The atmosphere in the diner was still heavy, but there was a new sense of empowerment. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the town wasn't completely under the thumb of the corrupt system. Isaiah glanced at Nora, offering a small but reassuring smile. "Document everything," he said. "Take photos if you can. We need to build a pattern." Nora nodded, already reaching for her phone. She was starting to understand that they weren't just fighting for Marcus anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had been too afraid to speak up. She wasn't going to back down either. Isaiah returned to his car, the weight of what had just happened settling in. He knew the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. Riker and his allies were starting to realize that their intimidation tactics weren't as effective as they once were. But Isaiah also knew that they were getting desperate. And when people like Riker started to get desperate, that was when they made mistakes. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes, though. He had to stay smart, stay ahead of them. If he was going to expose the corruption in this town, he needed to keep moving forward. He needed to stay one step ahead of the officers, the judge, the mayor, and anyone else who was part of the system that had protected Riker for far too long. And he wasn't alone anymore. More and more people were beginning to speak out, people who had once been too afraid to do so. They were starting to see that change was possible. Isaiah wasn't just fighting for Marcus. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. Eli Navarro's help and the revelation of deeper corruption. The following day, Isaiah received a cryptic message from an unknown number. The text simply read, "We need to talk. I can help." His heart skipped a beat. After everything that had happened, he knew this could be the breakthrough he'd been waiting for, or it could be another setup. He carefully considered the risk but ultimately knew that he couldn't afford to pass up an opportunity like this. The fight was far from over, and this could be the chance to get the evidence he needed to take down the entire system. He quickly texted back, "When and where?" The response came almost immediately, "Tomorrow. Abandoned gas station on Miller Road. 8 p.m. Come alone." Isaiah felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he didn't hesitate. He had been through enough dangerous situations in his career to know that fear was the enemy. He had to remain focused. The next night, Isaiah arrived at the abandoned gas station on Miller Road. The air was cool and still, the kind of night where the world felt eerily quiet. His headlights illuminated the cracked pavement as he drove into the lot, and he parked in a spot far from the entrance. He turned off the engine, staying alert, watching for any signs of movement. It wasn't long before he saw a figure emerge from behind the building. A man in a plain brown jacket and jeans, moving quickly and looking over his shoulder as though he didn't want to be seen. Isaiah's pulse quickened. This was it. The man stepped closer and Isaiah recognized him immediately, Deputy Eli Navarro. Eli had always struck Isaiah as someone who was by the book, but now, with his back hunched and his eyes darting nervously, he seemed a far cry from the confident, unshakable officer Isaiah had once known. "Deputy Navarro," Isaiah called out, his voice low but firm. Eli froze for a moment, then slowly approached, staying in the shadows. "Agent Holloway," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Thanks for meeting me." Isaiah could sense the tension in Eli's posture, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "What's going on, Eli? What do you know?" Eli glanced over his shoulder again before responding. "It's not just Riker. He's the enforcer, the visible face of it all, but the corruption runs deeper. The whole department is rotten. Has been for years." Isaiah's mind raced. He had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed was a bitter pill to swallow. "How deep are we talking, Eli?" Eli's voice was barely above a whisper. "Evidence disappears. Dashcam footage showing excessive force, technical malfunctions, witness statements about harassment, lost in processing. Drug money seized during raids? Never makes it to evidence. All of it covered up by the higher-ups." Isaiah was stunned. He had known there was corruption, but this went far beyond what he had imagined. The scope of it was overwhelming. "And you're telling me this now? Why?" Eli ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "Because I can't take it anymore. I tried speaking up once. Got jumped in the parking lot 2 days later. 3 guys in masks. They said if I talked again they'd do worse." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I can't keep doing this. People are getting hurt. I've been waiting for someone who can do something about it." Isaiah's gaze softened. "You're risking everything by talking to me, Eli. I'll protect you. But I need more than just words." Eli hesitated before pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was a small flash drive. "This is everything," he said. "Before they took the drive from the diner's security system, I copied all the footage, everything. It shows what happened to your son. It's clear as day. They can't bury this. Not if it comes from a federal agent." Isaiah's heart raced as he took the flash drive, knowing this could be the key to everything. The truth right there in his hands. "Thank you, Eli. I won't let this be in vain. But you need to be careful. If they find out you've been talking." "I know," Eli interrupted, his voice tight with fear. "I don't care anymore. I can't keep living like this. Just make it count." Isaiah nodded, his mind already racing through the next steps. This was the evidence he had needed. But Eli's warning echoed in his mind, "Be careful." He had to keep moving forward, but now, more than ever, he needed to be smart.